thank all of you who are here today. This is an astounding turnout because you now are energized because you want to take back the future. And this is a place, Eagle Forum, where we can agree with our former President Ronald Reagan, who said this: freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It's not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. Those who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. And I think there's a collective sense growing all across our country that President Reagan's concern for the loss of our freedom could be realized before our very eyes, even in this generation. And a continued erosion of freedom occurred, unfortunately, under Republican leadership, when Republicans spent way too much money and they committed the American taxpayer to pay the freight for what other Americans can and should be paying for themselves. Washington, D.C. isn't exactly, I agree with you, Washington, D.C. isn't exactly the in place to be right now if you're Republican, unless you're Colin Powell. But liberals and the mainstream media, oh, sorry, I was redundant there. Liberals and the mainstream media are constantly crying that free markets have failed and that Big Daddy government needs to take over. Well, Big Daddy government certainly has taken over. Since the inception of Bailout Nation less than a year ago, it's incredible. An economist from Trent Frank's home state at Arizona State University calculated this. Now be sure you listen. The federal government now today owns or controls 30% of private business profits. Now just realize, a year ago, 100% of private business profits were owned or controlled by private business. Today it's 30% of private business profits. After AIG, Bear Stearns, the $700 billion bailout, Freddie, Fannie, the mortgage bailout, Chrysler, GM, and if President Obama has his way, and the government takes over 18% of the private wealth that's created in the healthcare economy, the federal government will then own or control 48% of the American private business profits. And Trent and Steve remember, the last vote we took last week, the federal government nationalized, took over the student loan industry. 25 years ago, 100% of all student loans were private. But Congress decided we needed a public option in student loans. The problem was people preferred the private student loans. They weren't buying the public option. Well, government didn't like competition, so what'd they do? They decided to shut down the private student loan industry completely. They took it over. And this is nothing new from this White House, which through the Automobile Task Force handed out pink slips, 3,400 pink slips to privately owned auto dealerships across our country. Multi-generational dealerships were destroyed overnight by our government. These actions are nothing more than gangster government, pure and simple. And if our comatose mainstream media had just a modicum of self-respect, they would have sounded the alarm bells a long time ago. After all, they live and work in this country too, but instead they applaud their soulmate president. But the people are speaking here too. Ad revenue for major newspapers across our country declined 29% in the second quarter of this year. How do you stay alive when your revenues decline 29%? Well, they aren't. The New York Times had to sell its flagship New York City building. I know you're crying crocodile tears over that. Paper after paper has been declaring bankruptcy and reorganizing, and now Speaker Pelosi wants a media bailout by granting our newspapers a nonprofit status. Well, Madam Speaker, that's a little redundant too, because nonprofit is the fate of the mainstream media. Next, our president is planning to take over the energy industry, and he's planning to do this through his national energy tax. The cap and tax gives government control over virtually every aspect of American life because there's hardly anything that's made that doesn't somehow require energy. That's 8% of private wealth that's produced in America. Now we'd be up to 56% of the private economy owned or controlled by the federal government in just about 1 year's time. That's stunning. That's stunning. Let's go back again. Now really listen to President Reagan's comment that I read to you before. Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than 1 generation away from extinction. It's not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. Those who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. We have witnessed in this time 30% takeover, and very shortly it could be 56. It's ours now to take it back.